Secret Snapdragon Studio by Catherine Waltan. All rights reserved. Chapter 1. Art in Bloom. The morning sun filtered through the windshield of Helen Lighthall's cherry red Subaru, casting golden streaks across the dashboard like brushstrokes on a canvas. As she turned onto Snapdragon Lane, the world seemed dipped in watercolor. Pastel skies stretched overhead, dew-speckled wildflowers bobbed along the roadside, and dappled shadows from sycamore trees reached lazily across the pavement. Spring had arrived in full flourish, and even Helen's usually skeptical heart felt lifted by the quiet charm of it all. In the back seat, Halo, her cheerful yellow Labrador, was already on alert, ears perked, eyes bright, and tail thumping against the upholstery. Beside him, Shadow, the black lab with a graying muzzle and the gaze of an old philosopher, sat in solemn contrast. His head rested against the window as if he were already judging the day ahead. "Almost there," Helen said aloud, adjusting the rearview mirror to glance at them both. Snapdragon Studio, just a peaceful little art class. What could possibly go wrong? She winced. That phrase had never once worked in her favor. The studio came into view as the road curved, a whimsical building nestled at the edge of a wild garden. It looked like something from a storybook, a former Victorian greenhouse, lovingly converted into an arts collective. Ivy trailed along its weathered brick walls, leaded glass windows shimmered in the sunlight, and a turret-like sunroom jutted from the back like a teacup on a saucer. A hand-painted wooden sign hung above the arched door, swaying gently in the breeze. Snapdragon Studio, where creativity blooms. Helen parked beneath a flowering dogwood tree, whose branches were just beginning to burst with pink blossoms. As she stepped out, the scent of lilac, freshly turned soil, and, bless it all, coffee drifted to meet her. The air hummed with the quiet buzz of bees and distant laughter. The dogs leapt from the car with practiced grace, tails wagging as if they too had signed up for the watercolor workshop. Halo bounded ahead, nose already to the ground, while Shadow trotted behind him with quiet dignity. The garden outside the studio was a living canvas of color. Clusters of artists wandered between easels, set among tulips and bleeding hearts, sipping from mismatched ceramic mugs and murmuring critiques of each other's sketches. Ceramic wind chimes tinkled from porch rafters like musical punctuation marks. A long farmhouse table near the front steps overflowed with croissants, cinnamon knots, and a stack of crisp, untouched watercolor pads. "Helen!" A familiar voice rang out over the garden. From the studio's doorway emerged Camilla Rowan, silver-haired and statuesque, her linen tunic cinched with a belt that looked suspiciously handmade. A silk scarf in vibrant coral fluttered around her neck like a signature flourish. "Camilla Rowan," Helen called, grinning as she opened her arms. "You haven't aged a day." "Liar," Camilla replied, embracing her. "But I'll take the compliment. You, however, retirement suits you. You've got that well-fed, well-rested glow." Helen chuckled. "Well-fed, yes. Rested? That depends on how often Shadow decides 4 a.m. is the right time for existential howling." Camilla crouched to scratch behind Shadow's ears and offered Halo a sugar-free biscuit from her tunic pocket. "They're even more handsome than I remember." "They've solved more crimes than most detectives I know," Helen said, brushing a speck of fur off her sleeve. Camilla arched an eyebrow. "Still in the business of nosing around, are you?" Helen's grin tilted wry. "Only when something smells funny." Camilla led her up the steps and into the studio's welcoming foyer. The air inside was infused with the scents of lavender, old books, and paper. Watercolor landscapes adorned the walls, each piece labeled with a small, handwritten tag. A vase of sun-bright ranunculus perched on the reception desk, a splash of orange and yellow joy. From the adjoining rooms came the quiet clatter of brushes and the low murmur of creativity. Helen paused, taking it in. "It's beautiful, Camilla. You've created something really special here." Camilla's gaze softened. "It's been more than a project. It's a second act, a place to let people breathe." As they passed a row of cubbies, Helen peeked into sunlit spaces where students hunched over canvases or delicately brushed glaze onto clay. There was laughter, concentration, and something else, an undercurrent of quiet purpose. They stepped into the main classroom, where a semicircle of easels faced a wall of tall windows that framed the garden like a painting itself. At the far end stood a slender woman with red curls pinned into a careful bun, her hands fussing over a large floral still life. "That's Lena Voss," Camilla said in a low voice. "Our visiting artist, from the coast. Brilliant, yes, but difficult. She looks intense. She teaches with a velvet hammer, invitation-only class, hand-picked students." "That rubs people the wrong way," Helen murmured. "Exactly. She claims she's here to rediscover joy, but I'm not convinced she left the drama behind." Lena turned abruptly, eyes scanning the room until they landed on Helen. Her gaze dropped to the dogs. "Are those going to be an issue?" she asked, her voice crisp as pressed linen. "Only if your paintbrushes smell like bacon," Helen replied without missing a beat. For a heartbeat, Lena's face didn't move. Then, barely, her lips twitched. Almost a smile. She gave a brisk nod and returned to her canvas. Camilla leaned in. "That's the warmest I've seen her all week." Later that afternoon, after a round of polite introductions and steaming cups of chamomile tea, Helen claimed a spot near the back patio with her sketchpad. She wasn't an artist, never claimed to be, but there was something meditative about holding a pencil, even if all she produced were squiggles that vaguely resembled flowers. Shadow lay curled at her feet like a sentinel, while Halo sprawled in a patch of sunlight, belly exposed to the sky. Helen tried to sketch a daffodil, but ended up drawing something that looked suspiciously like a trumpet with leaves. Across the patio, Lena and Camilla stood in quiet conversation again. But this time, their body language had changed. No more light chatter. Camilla's arms were crossed. Lena's posture was rigid, her gestures sharp. Though Helen couldn't hear the words, she could feel the tension from across the garden. Lena pointed to something, perhaps a canvas, perhaps a notebook, then shook her head. Camilla replied, voice low, expression taut. After a few moments, Lena turned on her heel and walked briskly toward the private studio wing. Camilla remained for a second longer, staring after her before rubbing her temples and walking the other way. Helen frowned and returned her attention to her sketchpad, but the flower suddenly looked more like a question mark. She didn't want to be suspicious, but in her experience, arguments in tranquil settings had a way of blooming into something darker. That evening, after a dinner of grilled cheese and tomato bisque, Helen leashed up the dogs for their evening stroll. The night air was crisp, scented with jasmine and wood smoke. When they returned home, Helen remembered the lemon bars she'd promised Camilla, still sitting on the kitchen counter. With a sigh, she grabbed the basket, clipped the dogs' leashes back on, and headed for Snapdragon. The studio was mostly dark now, quiet except for the gentle creak of wood and distant frog song. A few upstairs windows glowed faintly. Helen let herself in through the back entrance, humming as she made her way toward the kitchen. As she passed the main studio, something red on the floor caught her eye. A smear of deep crimson. Her heart stuttered. She stepped closer. Not blood, paint. Alizarin crimson, thick and glossy, smeared across the wood floor. A palette lay overturned nearby, its colors bleeding together. Helen followed the trail. Slowly, cautiously. The glass garden door stood slightly ajar. Outside, the garden glowed in moonlight. Beeswax lanterns flickered gently on wrought iron hooks, casting slow-moving shadows. And floating in the koi pond, face down, curls fanned in the water, scarf tangled in lily pads, was Lena Voss. Helen stopped. The basket of lemon bars slipped from her hands, scattering across the stones like petals. Halo barked once. Shadow growled low. Helen reached into her coat for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed. "I knew this watercolor retreat was too peaceful to be true," she whispered. Chapter 2. A Stained Canvas. The koi pond shimmered beneath the beeswax lanterns, the still surface broken only by the faint ripple of movement, just enough to make the lily pads tremble. Lena Voss floated face down in the water, her vibrant scarf now a waterlogged coil tangled in reeds. Her fiery red hair fanned out like an ink stain, and her pale hands drifted just beneath the surface. Helen stood frozen on the flagstone path, her breath caught somewhere between a gasp and a scream. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't think. The scent of lilac and damp stone suddenly turned cloying. Then instinct took over. She dropped to one knee and grabbed Shadow's collar, giving a quick, sharp whistle to Halo. The yellow lab circled anxiously, but obediently sat beside her. Helen reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her phone. Her hands trembled as she activated Siri. "Siri," she said, voice hoarse, "call Sheriff Mike Arrington." A brief pause, and then the dial tone. She barely registered the ringing. Her eyes never left the pond. The way Lena's scarf floated like a warning flag, the eerie calm. "Helen?" Mike's voice broke through, calm but alert. "She's dead," Helen whispered. "Lena Voss. I found her in the koi pond at Snapdragon." "Are you safe?" "I'm not the one floating face down. I'm on my way. Stay put. Don't touch anything." Helen hung up and exhaled shakily. She looked around. The garden was quiet, undisturbed, too quiet. She didn't believe in omens. But the air tonight, it felt cursed. By the time Sheriff Mike Arrington arrived, jeans tucked into his boots, badge clipped to his belt, and a flashlight in hand, Helen had cordoned off the garden using overturned garden chairs and 2 potted succulents. Shadow and Halo remained nearby, both unnervingly quiet, watching the pond like it might spring to life again. Mike ducked beneath a trellis and took in the scene with a practiced eye. "Walk me through it," he said. Helen recounted everything, her return to drop off lemon bars, the darkened studio, the smear of crimson paint in the hallway, the open door to the garden, and finally, the body. She wasn't painting, no brush in hand, no palette. "The scarf might have caught on something, but it feels wrong," she added. "Too staged." Mike frowned, stepping carefully toward the pond's edge. He shined his flashlight over the surface, illuminating the fringe of Lena's scarf as it fluttered in the water. "That scarf," he said. "She wore it every day. Camilla said it was her lucky talisman. Hand-dyed silk from Paris." Helen nodded, said it gave her presence. He crouched near the flagstones and gestured to a muddy print, boot-shaped, partially smeared, but definitely not Helen's Skechers. "Not yours?" he asked. Helen lifted one foot. "Bone dry." He stood and looked at her. "If this was an accident, it's a very suspicious one." Helen's gaze drifted toward the darkened studio. "We should check inside." Inside Lena's private studio, the air was heavier, denser somehow, like it remembered what had happened. A desk lamp still glowed faintly, casting a pool of golden light across a cluttered work table. Canvases were stacked in loose piles, some slanted at odd angles. Watercolor tubes spilled from a cracked wooden box. The whole room felt abandoned mid-moment. On the easel sat an unfinished painting, snapdragons in vibrant fuchsia, stems curling like smoke. It was beautiful, alive, too alive for the silence that surrounded it. Helen's eyes scanned the space. An overturned stool near the easel, a palette smashed on the floor. Crimson paint smeared in a streak across the tile floor, leading away from the easel toward the hallway. Mike stepped carefully, his flashlight sweeping the corners. "Looks like there was a struggle," he said quietly. Helen nodded. "Or at least a moment of panic." She moved toward the desk, brushing aside a sketchbook to reveal a small, leather-bound journal. It was worn at the edges, flecked with dried paint. She opened it to the last page. Lena's handwriting was bold and hurried. "If Camilla won't listen, I'll handle it myself. She's been warned. She has until Friday." Helen passed it silently to Mike. "She wasn't just teaching here," she said. "She was confronting someone." Mike closed the journal slowly, and she might have just made herself a target. Back in the main studio, the space felt like an empty church. The watercolors on the walls stared down at them like silent witnesses. Camilla sat in the kitchenette, pale and wide-eyed, clutching a chipped mug of herbal tea. Her lipstick was smudged, and her cardigan buttoned all the way to her neck, as if trying to hold herself together. "I heard the sirens," she said, voice shaking. "Lena, is she—" Helen nodded gently. Camilla looked down into her mug. She loved that pond, said it helped her center. Mike stepped forward. "Camilla, we're treating this as suspicious. We need to know what happened today. Helen mentioned you, and Lena argued." Camilla closed her eyes briefly. "Yes, we did. She accused me of stealing a design." "Did you?" Helen asked. "No," Camilla said. "At least, not intentionally. We'd both been working with botanical symmetry, similar themes. She said I lifted her style for the spring exhibit poster. And you disagreed. I told her we were drawing from the same source, nature, flowers, geometry, but she wouldn't hear it." Mike took notes quietly. "Did you speak to her after that?" "No. She left in a huff and locked herself in the studio. I went home around 4. Helen studied her. Camilla looked genuinely shaken, but guilt had layers. She'd seen it often enough. "Was there anyone else she'd argued with recently?" Helen asked. Camilla hesitated. "Possibly. She didn't get along with Finn, the pottery instructor, or Jasper, the mixed media artist, but Lena had a way of rubbing people the wrong way." Mike glanced at Helen. "We'll need to speak with both of them." Later that evening, Mike secured the studio and ordered crime scene techs to begin documentation in the morning. Helen lingered in the garden, walking slowly through the moonlit paths, letting her thoughts settle. The koi pond was now cordoned off with yellow tape. The lantern still flickered gently. The peace of the place was a stark contrast to the crime. Shadow pressed against her leg. Halo nosed at a bush, ears perked. She bent down and whispered, "We're in it now, boys." The dogs wagged their tails. Back at home, Helen sat curled on her sofa, untouched tea cooling beside her. A notebook lay open in her lap. She scribbled names across the top in neat rows. Camilla, studio owner, accused of design theft. Finn, pottery instructor, history of creative conflict with Lena. Jasper, mysterious artist, no visible background. Lena, victim, but also investigator. Shadow shifted at her feet, letting out a low woof. Halo rolled over and snored. Helen tapped the pencil against her notebook. There were secrets at Snapdragon, and secrets always had a way of rising to the surface, especially when someone tried to bury them. Chapter 3, Brushstrokes and Blame. Helen stood just inside the entrance to Snapdragon Studio the next morning, pausing as the scent of lavender oil, paper, and acrylic paints greeted her like an old friend, though today it felt more like a ghost. The warm golden light that filtered through the arched greenhouse windows painted the floors in rainbows, but there was a heaviness in the air. A hush. The kind of stillness that came not from peace, but from grief. It had only been 12 hours since Lena Voss was found in the koi pond, and though the official word hadn't yet been released to the public, word spread fast in places like this. Art studios, small towns, cozy hideaways, where secrets never stayed buried for long. Helen glanced around the studio. The usual chatter of artists sipping coffee and arranging supplies was replaced with anxious glances and whispered speculation. A pottery student dropped a jar of paint water, and no one scolded or laughed. It was as if everyone had been holding their breath since the night before, and still didn't know whether to exhale. She spotted Camilla near the front window, her pale blue cardigan buttoned all the way to her collarbone, clipboard held in a hand that trembled just slightly. She looked like she hadn't slept, and like she was trying not to show it. Helen crossed the room slowly, Shadow and Halo padding behind her like well-behaved detectives in training. "Morning," Helen said softly, not sure whether it was the right word anymore. Camilla glanced up, startled. "Oh, Helen, you're early." "Habit. Brought muffins." Helen held up a basket covered with a linen cloth. Blueberry lavender, comfort carbs. Camilla gave a tight smile. "I might eat the whole basket. Mike asked me to keep the studio closed today. Says they're not done with the investigation. I canceled all workshops." "Smart," Helen said. Everyone's too shaken to focus anyway. Camilla stared out the window for a moment, eyes distant. I've hosted potters, poets, printmakers, even that one woman who claimed to channel spirits through paintbrushes. But I've never dealt with something like this. A death, a body. It feels violating. Helen nodded. This place has always been about growth, expression, healing, but even safe spaces can hide shadows. Camilla turned sharply. Do you think someone here, someone in the studio, could have done it? I think someone here had a reason to want Lena gone. That's enough to warrant a closer look. Camilla's shoulders sagged slightly. Then you should know. Lena wasn't just fighting with me. Helen raised an eyebrow. She had a confrontation with Finn, loud enough that students heard it. Helen nodded slowly. The pottery instructor? Yes, 2 days ago. She accused him of copying one of her glaze patterns and passing it off as his own. Did he admit it? Denied everything. He was furious. Said he'd been experimenting with that glaze for months. But Lena claimed it was hers, an original formula she developed during a residency. Helen crossed her arms. And that's not all, is it? Camilla hesitated, then sighed. There's someone else, a new artist, Jasper Quinn, mixed media, keeps to himself, pays in cash. Lena didn't trust him either. Why? She said he was a fraud, that he was using other people's techniques and passing them off as original. She even wanted to go through his sketchbooks, said she needed proof. Helen made a mental note. That's 2 arguments and 2 threats, before breakfast. Camilla managed a half laugh, but it was hollow. Helen squeezed her shoulder gently. We'll figure this out, but I'll need to ask questions, the kind that might make people uncomfortable. Camilla nodded. Ask anything. Just promise me one thing. What's that? Don't let this place turn cold. Helen gave her a small smile. It won't, but we need to uncover the rot before we can replant. Later that morning, Helen made her way to the pottery wing. The space smelled of damp clay and wood ash. Rows of bisque-fired mugs lined the shelves, and the quiet whir of a pottery wheel filled the air like a heartbeat. Finn Douglas was hunched over a wheel, arms dusted with gray clay, fingers shaping a vase with slow, rhythmic movements. His usually relaxed posture was tight, the kind of tension that clung to a person after a restless night. Helen approached cautiously. Rough day for pots, she said. Finn didn't look up. Rough day for everything. You're still working. Clay doesn't ask questions. Helen leaned against a nearby counter. But I do. Finn sighed and sat back, wiping his hands on a towel. You here to accuse me? I'm here to ask about Lena. He glanced at her, jaw clenched. We didn't get along, that's not a secret. She accused you of stealing. She accused everyone of something. That was her hobby, cutting people down to size. Helen tilted her head. Did you? He looked her dead in the eye. No, I didn't steal her glaze. Yes, I worked on something similar. But similar isn't theft. In ceramics, inspiration travels. We learn from each other. Then why were you arguing with her? He hesitated. Because she threatened to have me blacklisted. Said she had contacts who could bar me from regional shows. She claimed she'd ruin my reputation. And what did you say? I told her to try, that she wasn't the gatekeeper of art. Then I left. Helen watched him closely. Where did you go after the argument? I went home, worked in my kiln shed, alone. Helen raised an eyebrow. Convenient. I don't have anything to hide. No? She nodded toward his drying shelves. Because if someone wanted to hide evidence, say, a smear of paint or a broken brush, this is a good place to bury it. Finn's eyes narrowed. I didn't kill her, Helen. She was cruel, but she didn't deserve that. Helen studied his face. There was anger there, yes, but not the kind that simmers into violence. Still, grief could twist even the gentlest soul. I hope you're telling the truth, she said, turning toward the exit, because lies tend to crack faster than a poorly glazed teacup. Sheriff Mike met Helen back in Lena's studio around noon. He had a tablet in hand and a frustrated expression. "We ran Jasper Quinn's name," he said. "No criminal record. But no real credentials either. No solo shows, no portfolio on file, no verified sales. It's like he appeared out of nowhere 6 months ago." "Ghost artist," Helen said. "Or a forger." "We're about to find out." Together they walked down the side hall to Jasper's assigned studio space, an old potting shed now converted into a minimalist workspace. The space was immaculately clean. Too clean. 3 canvases leaned against the far wall, all abstract compositions in grays and greens. No splatters, no smudges, no signs of actual work being done. Helen frowned. "Where are the brushes, the sketchbooks? Even the messy geniuses I've known leave behind some chaos." Mike opened a drawer. Empty. Another. Empty. Shadow padded into the room and sniffed near the cabinet in the corner. Halo followed and let out a low, questioning woof. Helen opened the cabinet and found a worn canvas bag. Inside were several portfolios. She opened one and froze. They were floral studies, delicate, luminous, unmistakable. Lena's work, or rather, perfect copies of it. Even the signatures had been modified slightly, but not enough to fool someone who had seen the originals. "Mike," she said, passing him the folder. He flipped through it, eyes hardening. Forgery. And motive. They found Jasper on the cafe patio, sipping espresso, sunglasses perched on his nose despite the overcast sky. "You've got some explaining to do," Mike said casually, taking the seat across from him. Jasper leaned back, unbothered. "To what do I owe the honor?" "We found your bag, the one with Lena's work inside." Jasper didn't flinch. "She said I could study it." Verbatim? She said, and I quote, "You could learn something from real talent." So I did. Helen folded her arms. "You forged her pieces." "Why?" Jasper took off his sunglasses slowly. "Because talent doesn't pay the bills, but a recognizable signature? That opens doors." Mike's jaw tightened. "Where were you last night between 8 and 10? "In my studio, alone." "Of course you were," Helen muttered. Jasper gave a lazy smile. "Let me know if you find a canvas that points fingers." That afternoon, the energy inside Snapdragon had shifted again. The fear was still present, but now it mingled with suspicion and unease. People avoided eye contact. Artists packed their supplies with jerky movements. Camilla announced that all classes were postponed indefinitely. Helen returned home with a second muffin basket and a head full of questions. She fed the dogs, then curled up in her sunroom with her notebook. She scribbled, "Suspects. Finn, accused of stealing Glazed formulas. Argument with Lena, no alibi. Jasper, caught forging Lena's work, denies wrongdoing, no alibi. Camilla, accused of design theft. Argument confirmed. Studio reputation at risk. Victim, Lena Voss, watercolorist, sharp-tongued, unafraid of confrontation, threatened lawsuits, was building something, a case, a portfolio, a reckoning." Helen stared at the page. Something was still missing, a thread she hadn't tugged, but she could feel it. Beneath the surface, behind the sketches and glazes and polite studio smiles, someone had snapped. And Lena, for all her bravado, had known it was coming. Shadow let out a sleepy sigh. Halo pawed at his toy and rolled over. Helen tapped her pencil against her chin. "We're getting close," she said aloud. "Just one more layer to peel back." Chapter 4, Potted Clues. Helen returned to Snapdragon Studio the next morning with a fresh basket of blueberry muffins, a steaming travel mug of Earl Grey, and 2 energetic Labradors at her heels. The sun had only just crested the hills, casting long golden fingers across the gravel lot. The morning air was cool and crisp, tinged with the scent of rain-damp soil and the lingering sweetness of spring flowers. The studio was quiet, hushed in a way that spoke of mourning and uncertainty. A hand-painted sign on the front gate read, "Closed today for reflection." Helen didn't need a crowd to sense the tension. Snapdragon, usually a hive of creative hum, now felt like a museum between exhibits. still, watchful, waiting for something to change. She found Camilla in the courtyard, snipping back ivy that had crept too far up the stone archway. She looked pale but composed, her hands steady even as her eyes carried shadows beneath them. "Morning," Helen said gently, lifting the basket. "Muffins, fresh from the oven, no crime scene tape included." Camilla almost smiled. "I'll take 3, and a side of answers if you've got any." They sat together on a stone bench beneath the climbing roses, sipping coffee from mismatched mugs, and letting the garden speak in soft rustles and bird song. "I keep replaying it," Camilla said quietly, tearing the muffin into uneven pieces. "The last conversation we had. She was so angry, but underneath it, I think she was scared. Or maybe hurt." Helen nodded. She seemed like someone used to holding all the power, but something had shifted. "She felt betrayed," Camilla admitted. "By me, by the artists. She told me that art theft wasn't just about stealing ideas. It was about erasing people." Helen thought of Lena's voice, clipped and controlled. She wasn't wrong. Camilla exhaled. "I keep wondering, what if I'd just let it go? What if I hadn't defended my design so fiercely?" "You don't get to blame yourself for someone else's decisions," Helen said firmly. "Lena made a lot of enemies, but she also made choices. She could have handled things differently." Camilla was quiet for a long moment, watching bees flit between the lavender stalks. "She wasn't the only one keeping secrets," she said finally. Helen looked up. "Go on?" Camilla picked at her napkin. "She told me someone else in the studio was stealing, this time not from her, but from someone long gone. She never said who, just that she was documenting it." "Did she say why she didn't come forward?" "She said she needed proof, that accusations weren't enough anymore." Helen's mind sparked. She was building a case. Camilla nodded. She called it her insurance policy. Helen leaned back against the bench. "I think I need to check the garden." She walked the familiar paths with halo and shadow beside her, letting instinct guide her feet. The koi pond was still roped off with soft yellow tape, the lilies undisturbed. The lantern swayed faintly in the breeze, casting dappled shadows across the flagstone path. "All right, boys," she murmured. "Let's see what Lena left behind." Shadow's nose twitched. He trotted ahead toward the pottery studio, then veered left near the herb spiral. Halo followed, pausing to sniff the rosemary bushes. Suddenly, Shadow began pawing at the ground beneath a tall rosemary shrub. Halo let out a soft bark. "Shadow! Hey, hey! Easy!" Helen said, hurrying over. There, beneath a thin layer of soil and mulch, something metallic glinted in the morning sun. She knelt and brushed the dirt aside. A flash drive. Silver. Mud-caked. Taped in a small plastic sleeve marked with a tiny red dot. Helen stared. "Well, well," she murmured. "What are you?" She slipped it into her pocket and patted both dogs. "Good boys. You're getting extra biscuits tonight." Back inside the studio, Helen dug out an old laptop from Camilla's supply closet, a clunky thing that whirred like a plane on takeoff but still booted up. She wiped off the screen and slid the flash drive into the port. One folder, Lena, for insurance. Helen clicked it open. Inside were PDF scans, emails, images, detailed documentation. There were dated sketches, side-by-side comparisons of Lena's work, and pieces submitted to recent exhibits by others in the studio. In some cases, the images were nearly identical. Notes scrawled across the files said things like, color palette stolen, signature altered, glaze formula match. Helen's heart thudded as she clicked through each file. One PDF stood out, a legal draft of a cease and desist letter to Camilla Rowan regarding misappropriation of artistic property. The letter was blunt, legal language wrapped in razor wire. Lena had accused Camilla of copying a previous design from a gallery submission 5 years ago, one that had never been credited, and she had every intention of going public. Helen leaned back, the office chair creaking beneath her. She really was ready to go to war, she murmured. She picked up her phone. "Mike?" You're going to want to see this. By the time Sheriff Mike arrived, coffee in one hand, notepad in the other, Helen had printed several of the documents and lined them up across the studio's front desk. She buried this, Helen said, tapping the drive. Literally, under the rosemary bush. She must have known someone was watching her. Mike flipped through the papers, his face unreadable. This is detailed. Too detailed to be made up. Timelines, color comparisons, formula ratios, and she had legal letters drafted. She wasn't just angry, Helen said. She was scared. Mike nodded. And she had a list of names. Look here, there's a separate folder titled PC Submissions. He opened it. Helen leaned in. It was a spreadsheet. Names, initials, medium, submission dates, all traced back to something called the Palette Club. What the heck is that? Mike asked. I've heard of it, Helen said slowly. Camilla mentioned it once. It was an anonymous critique circle, a way for artists to get feedback without bias. But if people used it to hide behind initials and steal from each other, it's a perfect breeding ground for fraud, Mike finished. Helen stared at the screen. One column had the label Initials Used and included FDJQMWCR, Finn Douglas, Jasper Quinn, Melody Weaver, Camilla Rowan, Helen read aloud. Everyone had a reason to keep Lena quiet, Mike said grimly. Helen stood, her fingers curling around the back of the chair, and Lena was about to expose them all. Later that day, Helen returned to the garden. The rosemary bush swayed gently in the wind, leaves rustling like gossip. She let the dogs roam again, half hoping they'd unearth more flash drives. Instead, Halo barked near the potting bench. A moment later, Shadow began pawing at an overturned ceramic planter. Helen crouched. Inside the base of the pot, nestled beneath a tangle of dried moss, was a small black case about the size of a glasses box. She opened it slowly. Inside, a mini camera. She stared. Well, Lena, she whispered, you really were watching everything. Back at the studio, Helen connected the camera to the laptop. There was only one video stored, time-stamped the night before Lena's death. It was grainy, but clear enough. Lena's studio. Evening light slanting through the windows. Jasper Quinn entered first. He flipped through a sketchbook, took several photos with his phone, then quietly left. 10 minutes later, another figure entered. Melody Weaver. Helen leaned forward. Melody moved with purpose. She reached into her pocket and slipped a folded note into a second sketchbook. She paused, looked around, and left. Helen rewound the footage and played it again. Her breath caught. Melody hadn't just been a quiet observer. She was involved. And Lena had captured it all. Chapter 5. The Palette Club. Helen stared at the paused video frame on her laptop. Melody Weaver stood in the center of Lena's studio, slim and still, caught in the camera's lens like a deer in headlights. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to catch her face, her movements, her guilt. The soft clack of Shadow's tail tapping against the wooden floor broke the silence. Halo gave a low sigh from the rug beside the desk, completely unbothered by the brewing storm. Helen leaned back, trying to process it all. Melody had entered the studio after Jasper left. She hadn't lingered. She hadn't searched or snooped. She knew exactly what she was doing. Her hands didn't shake. She moved straight to Lena's second sketchbook, tucked a folded piece of paper into the center, then walked away like nothing had happened. This wasn't clumsy sabotage or a panicked mistake. It was deliberate, quiet, intentional. Helen clicked back through the footage, rewinding to the moment Jasper had entered. He moved differently, rushed, impulsive, taking photos like someone who didn't know what he'd find but was willing to take whatever he could. But Melody had known exactly what she wanted. Why? Helen stared at the screen, then whispered, "What were you hiding?" The next morning, Helen arrived at Snapdragon with a fresh tray of raisin bran muffins and 2 cups of cinnamon tea. Shadow and Halo trotted beside her, alert and content. The courtyard smelled like warm stone and lavender. Despite everything, spring was determined to keep blooming. Inside, artists spoke in hushed tones. The studio was still officially closed, but some returned to collect supplies or offer help. The tragedy had pulled them into orbit, some in grief, others in curiosity, and a few who simply didn't want to be alone. Helen found Camilla in the foyer, taping a notice on the bulletin board. All classes. Temporarily suspended until further notice. Her hands were steady, her posture less so. "I brought reinforcements," Helen said, holding out the tea. Camilla blinked at her, then smiled faintly. God bless muffins. They sat on the bench in the hallway, sipping in silence for a few minutes before Helen leaned in. "I need to talk to you about Melody." Camilla's brows furrowed. "Melody?" "She was in Lena's studio the night before she died, after Jasper left. I saw the footage." Camilla's teacup paused halfway to her lips. "Are you sure?" Helen nodded. "Lena had a hidden camera." Camilla leaned back, visibly shaken. "I had no idea." "Neither did anyone else." Helen hesitated, then added, "She slipped a note into one of Lena's sketchbooks. I don't know what it said, but it wasn't random. She was scared, but it was more than that." Camilla stood abruptly and walked to the bulletin board. She peeled off a faded flyer beneath the notice she'd just posted. The paper was curled and water-stained, but the title was still legible. The Palette Club. Monthly peer critiques, collaborative entries, anonymous feedback encouraged. Ask Camilla or Melody for access. Helen read it once, then again. "This is where it started, isn't it?" Camilla nodded slowly. "We created it a couple years ago. The idea was to encourage honest critiques. People submitted work under initials so no one would feel judged by their past projects. But if no one knew who was who..." "It got messy," Camilla admitted. Someone accused another artist of stealing a weaving pattern. Then there were whispers about recycled pottery glazes. Even some paintings turned up in 2 different portfolios. "And Melody was managing it?" "Half of it. I handled logistics. She sorted the actual submissions." Helen frowned. Lena hated the concept of anonymous art. She called it a license to plagiarize. Camilla nodded. "She said if you weren't brave enough to sign your name, you had no business putting brush to paper." Helen turned the flyer over. On the back were 4 sets of initials, handwritten in faded ink. MW, JQ, FD, and CR, Melody, Jasper, Finn, you. Camilla met her eyes. "We were the core members for a while. Others came and went, but we kept it small." Helen tapped the page. Lena was trying to unmask everyone, and she was getting close. Helen found Melody later that day in the weaving room, working with her usual quiet focus. The light filtering through the sunroom's tall windows bathed her in a soft glow. She sat at a loom near the far wall, threading strands of indigo and green into an abstract pattern that looked like spring rain. Shadow padded forward first, tail wagging. Halo followed, sitting near a crate of dyed yarn. Helen pulled up a chair. "Mind if I sit?" Melody gave a small shake of her head. She didn't look away from her work. Helen waited, watching her weave. "You went into Lena's studio the night before she died." Melody's hands slowed, not stopped, just slowed. "She had a camera," Helen added gently. Melody's fingers froze over a knot of yarn. "She found out," she whispered. Helen kept her voice calm. "About what?" Melody stared down at her loom. "About the commission. About the name." Helen tilted her head. "Start from the beginning." Melody finally looked up. "I paint," she said softly. "Not just weave, but people never noticed. They thought I was too quiet, too soft-spoken. So I submitted my florals anonymously through the Palette Club, and someone liked them. A buyer asked for a print. I used a pen name." Helen felt her stomach twist. "Whose?" Melody swallowed. "Lena's." Helen didn't speak. "It was just one time," Melody said quickly. "I didn't think it would go anywhere, but it did. It was entered in a local exhibit, won a small award. Lena found out." "She recognized her own work?" She recognized her influence, Melody said, and then she found the file, the entry with her name. But it wasn't her signature, it was mine. Helen tried to remain neutral. What did she do? She confronted me, told me to pull everything, said she wouldn't expose me if I stayed quiet and disappeared from the Palette Club. I agreed. I wrote her an apology. I put it in her sketchbook. You didn't hurt her? Melody shook her head. No, but I wanted her to go away. I was ashamed, and I didn't want Finn to get dragged into it. Helen raised an eyebrow. Finn? Melody hesitated, then said, some of his glaze formulas, they weren't entirely his. He inherited them. Helen blinked. From who? Melody didn't answer, but her face said enough. Helen leaned forward. Melody, did you ghostwrite Finn's glazes? I didn't mean to, she said. After his sister died, I left a sketchbook of my notes in his supply bin. I thought maybe it would help. He never knew it was mine. He thought it was hers, Lena Carter. Helen's heart skipped. LC, she whispered. Melody nodded. Helen sat back in stunned silence. You created a fictional artist, she said, voice almost reverent. A name, a legacy, and Finn built his career on it. I just wanted to help, Melody whispered. He was grieving, and I was tired of being invisible. Helen said nothing for a long time. Finally she stood. Thank you, she said, for trusting me. Melody nodded, eyes damp. What happens now? I don't know, Helen replied, but I think you've been carrying a secret that doesn't belong to you anymore. Later that evening, Helen returned home, notebook in hand. She sat on the front porch swing, dogs curled at her feet, and scribbled a new list. Secrets. Melody used Lena's name to sell her own art. She invented LC, and Finn unknowingly adopted the identity. Lena found out and threatened to expose them both. Jasper was forging Lena's work. Camilla received a cease and desist letter. The Palette Club hid dozens of anonymous submissions. And Lena? She had a list. She had proof. She had enemies. Helen exhaled and closed the notebook. There were too many secrets at Snapdragon, and one of them had turned deadly. Chapter 6. A Shattered Frame. The rain had started sometime after midnight, a soft, steady drizzle that soaked the Snapdragon garden and left the morning world glistening like a newly glazed ceramic bowl. Petals drooped with dew. The air smelled of wet soil and citrus leaves. Mist hung low over the koi pond, casting the studio grounds in a dreamy, almost surreal haze. Helen stepped carefully onto the flagstone path, umbrella tucked under one arm, a tray of cranberry-orange scones balanced in her hands. Halo, reluctantly wearing his yellow doggy raincoat, walked beside her with theatrical misery, while Shadow embraced the weather as if it gave him purpose. Despite the drizzle, Snapdragon Studio was stirring again. The investigation had forced Camilla to close most of the indoor workspaces, but the greenhouse and gallery room were open, tentatively, like someone peeking through a door after a storm. Inside, the light was golden and warm, but the mood remained subdued. Artists drifted through the rooms in silence, rearranging canvases, sweeping puddles from the porch, trying to reclaim a sense of normalcy. But the walls remembered. Helen set the scones in the kitchenette, refilled the kettle, and made her way to the main gallery. This had always been her favorite room, a former conservatory, converted into a soft-lit space for student work. The walls were lined with paintings, sketches, and mixed media pieces. Some were framed professionally, others hung from twine with clothespins. The variety gave the room its charm. But something felt off. Helen crossed to the far wall where a row of florals were arranged beneath a stained glass transom. One frame was tilted. She adjusted it and paused. The bottom edge of the frame was cracked. Not visible from a distance, but up close she could see the hairline fracture and glue residue. Odd, she murmured. She carefully lifted the frame from its hook. As she did, a slip of paper fluttered to the ground. She bent to pick it up. It was torn from a sketchbook, one of Lena's. She would have recognized that looped, confident handwriting anywhere. In the corner was a partial floral design, watercolor, light blue petals, faint but familiar. But it was the message in the margin that sent a chill down her spine. Melody's not the only one forging. Check the Glazed journals. They're not his, not even close. Helen stood frozen, paper in hand, heart pounding. This wasn't just about Melody. It never had been. She needed to find Mike. 10 minutes later, Helen climbed into the passenger seat of Mike's cruiser, parked just outside the studio's back gate. He handed her a paper cup of coffee from the corner gas station and glanced at the note. "She left it in a frame?" he asked, brow furrowed. Helen nodded. Stuffed behind one of the gallery pieces. She must have hidden it there before she died, maybe even hours before. And now we know for sure she was planning to expose multiple people. Mike tapped the slip of paper. "This is the second time Finn's been mentioned, first by Melody, now by Lena herself." "And if what Lena wrote is true," Helen added, "he wasn't just benefiting from Melody's anonymous glazes, he was claiming them as his own, possibly knowing the truth." Mike leaned back, processing. So Lena wasn't just mad, she was investigating. Helen pulled out her phone and scrolled to a photo she had taken the day before, a page from the Palette Club archives. "This is from a folder Melody showed me. It's marked LC and dated over 2 years ago." Mike studied the image. "Looks just like the glazing technique Finn used at the last regional show." Helen nodded. "Which means if Melody, under the alias LC, created those formulas and Finn claimed them later, he either didn't know or he did." Mike let out a breath. "And if Lena figured it out?" "She threatened to expose him, just like she did with Melody, just like she did with Camilla." They sat in silence for a moment, rain whispering against the windshield. Then Helen said softly, "We need to talk to Finn." Again. The pottery wing was quieter than usual. The large studio windows were fogged with condensation, and the faint scent of wet clay clung to the air like memory. Finn Douglas was at his wheel, shaping a wide, shallow bowl. His movements were slow and methodical, almost meditative. But Helen noticed the tightness in his shoulders, the stiffness in his jaw. She approached with halo and shadow behind her. The dogs didn't bark. They just watched. "Morning," Helen said. Finn didn't look up. "We're closed, technically." "Good thing I don't follow studio rules." He sighed and stopped the wheel. "You're here about Lena." "About her Glazed journal." Now he looked up, eyes narrowing. Helen stepped closer. "We found something, a note, from her. She claimed the glaze formulas you've been using weren't yours." Finn's expression flickered. "She's dead, Helen. She can't accuse anyone of anything." "But she did," Helen said quietly, "in writing, hidden behind a student painting." Finn stood abruptly, wiping his hands on a stained towel. "Those glazes, they're mine now. I've been using them for years." "But were they yours in the beginning?" He didn't answer. Helen tried a different approach. "Do you know who LC was?" Finn blinked. "Lena Carter, my sister." Helen held his gaze. "And where did you get the glaze formulas?" He hesitated. "They were in a sketchbook, left in my studio, a month after she died." Helen's voice softened. "That book wasn't hers." Finn's face tightened. "What are you saying?" "It was Melody's. She gave it to you anonymously. You assumed it was your sister's. She never corrected you." Finn sat down heavily on a stool, the towel still clutched in his hand. I didn't know," he whispered. "I thought it made sense. Lena was the only one who understood my experiments. I thought she'd written them before the accident. I wanted to believe it was her voice." "And when Lena Voss found out?" Helen asked gently. "She told me I was stealing from the dead, that she'd expose me. I told her she was wrong, that it didn't matter who wrote it. It was mine now. I'd made it mine." "But you knew," Helen said. "I didn't kill her," he said suddenly, his voice cracking. "I swear on my sister's grave, I didn't kill her. Helen studied him. He looked broken, not like a killer, but definitely like a man with something to hide. Back at her cottage that night, Helen sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by files, notebooks, screenshots, and empty teacups. The rain tapped against the windows, and Shadow snoozed by the door, while Halo rested his head on her slipper. She stared at her scribbled timeline. Lena, building a case. Melody, ghostwriting glazes. Finn, unknowingly or knowingly taking credit. Jasper, forging artwork. Camilla, facing legal action. And now, a cracked frame, a hidden note, a direct accusation. One thread pulled, and the whole tapestry unraveled. She picked up the photo from the spring studio brochure and studied it again. Lena standing in the garden, smiling slightly, arm extended, mid-gesture. In the background, a shadow, a shape, a man, just barely in frame. Helen zoomed in. Not Finn, not Jasper, not Mike. A different outline, broader shoulders, black hoodie, a camera bag at his hip. She froze. Chad, the studio assistant, the quiet one in the background of every meeting, every event, every critique. He'd been there the night of Lena's death. She was sure of it. Helen stood. I think, she told the dogs, we've been looking at the wrong artist. Chapter 7. A Glazed Overlie. Helen didn't wait until morning. She grabbed her raincoat from the hook by the door, stepped into her boots, and tossed a chew stick to each of her labs. You two hold down the fort, she said, brushing a hand over Shadow's head and giving Halo a quick kiss on the nose. Both dogs looked up with mild concern as she flew out the door. The rain had mostly stopped, but mist still hovered low over the fields like a forgotten veil. Her windshield wipers gave a rhythmic squeak as they brushed away fine droplets clinging to the glass. Street lamps cast long, broken reflections on the wet pavement as she drove, the Subaru humming like a restless whisper beneath her. Her mind raced with everything Mike had told her. Melody's name was on the second set of Glazed journals. That changed everything. If true, it meant Melody hadn't just been a peripheral figure in Lena's accusations. She had been at the center, a ghostwriter of ceramic formulas, a secret contributor to Finn's success, and now, a suspect. Helen pulled into the gravel lot at Snapdragon Studio, the crunch of tires loud in the stillness. Mike's cruiser was already there, parked beneath the dripping dogwood tree near the garden shed, headlights off, his silhouette visible in the driver's seat. She left her umbrella on the passenger seat, no time for pretense, and jogged across the lot. Rain slicked her cheeks, but she barely noticed. Mike stepped out, holding a weathered cardboard box in his hands. You brought the journals? She asked, panting slightly as she reached him. Mike nodded, jaw tight. Every page signed. Melody's handwriting clear as day. Dates, glaze formulas, notes on firing temperatures, everything. And they all predate Finn's work. Helen stared at the box as if it contained dynamite. So, Melody didn't just ghostwrite art for Lena. She ghostwrote the very formulas Finn built his name on? That's what it looks like. She folded her arms, partly against the cold, partly from the weight of realization. But why wouldn't she come forward? She could have cleared her name, maybe even protected Finn. Unless she had something to hide, Mike said softly. Helen shook her head, brows furrowed. Or someone to protect. A silence settled between them, heavy as the fog drifting through the courtyard. The truth was circling closer. But truths, Helen knew, rarely came gently. Back inside Snapdragon Studio, the tension was unmistakable. The air felt tighter, charged. Students whispered in hallways, pretending to work while glancing over their shoulders. The gentle clatter of brushes and clay tools was overlaid with the buzz of speculation. Helen caught fragments as she moved through the main corridor. Melody's been here forever. She wouldn't hurt a fly. I always thought Finn's glazes were suspiciously advanced. Overnight genius? Please. Maybe Shadow did it. He's got that mystery-solving glint in his eye. Helen couldn't help but smile faintly at that last one. At least someone still believed in her dogs. She found Melody in the weaving room, tucked into the corner beneath the skylight, her hands resting on an untouched pile of navy yarn. The loom stood idle, untouched threads trailing like neglected stories. Her posture was slumped, eyes vacant. Helen closed the door gently behind her and sat beside her friend. "I saw the journals," she said, her voice low. Melody didn't look up. Her eyes were fixed on a fraying edge of her yarn basket. "You wrote them," Helen continued. "Every glaze formula Finn used, you developed them. Lena figured it out." Still, no reply, just the steady ticking of the wall clock. "You could have come forward," Helen said. "Stopped all of this. Why didn't you?" Finally, Melody whispered, "Because Finn didn't know." Helen's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Melody looked up slowly. Her eyes were glassy with unshed tears and her voice trembled. "I gave him the journal anonymously, after his sister died. He was so broken, so lost. I left it where he'd find it. I never signed it. I thought it would help him heal." Helen stared. "You created his reputation." "I didn't want fame," Melody said. "I just wanted my work to live, to be used, to matter." The yarn in her lap twisted through her fingers, a nervous habit Helen had seen 100 times. "It wasn't about credit. It was about survival. I didn't want the spotlight. I loved watching him thrive." Helen's voice softened. "You never told him?" Melody shook her head. "He wouldn't have accepted it. He needed to believe he'd done it on his own. It gave him confidence, a future dot." Helen exhaled, her mind spinning. But then Lena saw something. "A test tile," Melody said. "I was recreating an older formula. Lena recognized it. Years ago, she accused me of stealing it from her. But the truth is, she took it from me." "And she was going to go public again," Helen murmured. Melody nodded. "She said the truth needed sunlight, that people deserved to know where the ideas really came from. But that would have destroyed Finn. He didn't know he'd built his career on someone else's work." Helen stared at her friend, torn between admiration and frustration. "So, what did you do?" she asked. "I begged her," Melody said. Her voice cracked. "I offered to stop making glazes, to disappear again, but she just smiled, this cold, determined smile, and said it was too late." A tear slipped down Melody's cheek. "I didn't kill her, Helen. I swear to you." Helen reached out and gently squeezed her hand. "I believe you," she said, but her mind was already racing. If Melody didn't stop Lena, then who did? Later that afternoon, Helen sat across from Mike in his office at the sheriff's substation, a mug of herbal tea warming her hands as they reviewed both sets of Glazed journals. Outside, the sky had darkened again, rain returning in gentle waves. Mike tapped his pen against a yellow notepad. "Handwriting analyst says both journals were written by the same person, Melody. It's airtight." Helen nodded slowly. "This isn't just about art theft. It's about identity. Melody gave her work to others, trusted them to carry it forward. Lena tried to claim it, then tried to expose it. She made herself judge and jury." "And someone didn't like that," Mike said. "The question is, who?" Helen leaned forward. "Lena exposed Camilla, humiliated Melody, and cornered Finn. She had a pattern: dig, reveal, destroy. One of them had to snap." Mike glanced at a stack of photos on his desk. "Or maybe someone we're overlooking." Helen reached for the spring retreat brochure again. She flipped it over, staring at the group photo. Lena standing in the courtyard, gesturing passionately. In the background, someone stood just behind her. Not Finn, not Camilla, not Jasper, someone else. Tall, narrow frame, hoodie, holding a black folder. Helen narrowed her eyes. "Mike, who's that?" He squinted. "Chad Warren, studio tech, handles the digital archive and cameras, quiet guy, lives in the carriage house." Helen frowned. "He's not on the suspect list." "No motive," Mike said. "No connection to Lena. Not that we know of." Helen flipped the brochure over and tapped the fine print. Photography by Chad Warren. She looked up slowly. What if he wasn't just taking pictures? That evening, with a signed warrant in hand, Mike and Helen walked through the empty Snapdragon hallways and into the digital archive room where Chad worked. The air buzzed faintly with electricity and the scent of printer ink. Banks of computers lined the walls, cables neatly looped. A screen glowed softly in sleep mode. Chad wasn't there, but his laptop was. Password protected, of course. "Can we get in?" Helen asked. Mike shook his head. "Not yet. But look." He reached under the desk and pulled out a drawer. Shadow, trailing behind them, sniffed at the underside of the desk and barked once. Mike crouched. Taped to the underside, a thumb drive. Helen raised an eyebrow. "Nice work, Shadow." They plugged it into one of the department's laptops and opened the folders. What they found was chilling. Dozens of video files, not from official studio cameras, but from Chad's own hidden devices, mounted in corners, hidden near vents, facing workspaces, private rooms. "He was watching everything," Mike muttered. They clicked on the final file, timestamped just 2 hours before Lena's death. Lena appeared on screen, pacing in the courtyard, agitated. Chad approached. They exchanged words. His body language tense. He held a black folder. She pointed at it, jabbing a finger toward his chest. He reached forward, grabbed her scarf. She turned, pulling away. He followed. There was a scuffle. She slipped, fell. The camera caught everything. Chad stood there for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away. Helen sat frozen, watching the screen. Mike's voice was tight. It wasn't premeditated. He didn't push her with the intent to kill. But he didn't help her either, Helen whispered. He walked away and tried to hide it. He buried the footage. Probably hoped the storm would wash the evidence away. She stared at the still frame, Lena's scarf caught in Chad's hand, her body limp in the pond behind him. Intent or not, Helen said, her voice low, he let her die. And then tried to erase the truth. Shadow let out a soft growl from the corner. Helen reached down and scratched behind his ears. "Well, boy," she murmured, "I think we just solved a murder." Chapter 8. Garden of Secrets. Snapdragon Studio was unusually still the next morning. The usual hum of brushes, laughter, and radio jazz had given way to silence, broken only by the distant coo of doves in the eaves. The sun, finally unburdened by the storm, broke through in buttery streaks, casting the garden in shimmering golds and emerald greens. The rain-soaked leaves glistened like they'd been lacquered by hand. Everything looked clean, polished, even hopeful. And yet, underneath all that beauty, the air held a tension like the fading ring of a bell, still reverberating after a hard strike. Helen stood just outside the herb spiral, hands tucked deep into her coat pockets. Shadow paced beside her, nose to the ground. Halo, ever the optimist, had his face buried in a patch of rosemary, tail wagging like nothing at all had happened. But everything had. The image of Lena's scarf, still wrapped around Chad's fist in the surveillance footage, replayed in Helen's mind like a painting she couldn't scrub from memory. His face, expressionless, almost bored, as he walked away from the pond, leaving Lena floating in the moonlight. And now, he was gone. Vanished. A suitcase missing, his room in the carriage house stripped of anything important, including his laptop. Helen took a long breath. She had a feeling Chad wouldn't get far. People like him weren't built to run. They were built to hide. Still, she didn't like unfinished stories. Her eyes drifted to the koi pond. Yellow tape fluttered lightly in the breeze, looped around iron posts to cordon off the area. The pond was still, glassy, deceptive in its calm. "Let's go," she murmured, and the dogs fell in step beside her. She followed the winding gravel path to the greenhouse tucked behind the main building, a favorite retreat of Lena's. Its frame was a charming jumble of iron and foggy glass panes, now streaked with rainwater. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp soil, lemon balm, and old clay. Vines stretched across the ceiling like lazy fingers. Moss had colonized the stone floor. Clay pots sat in precarious stacks, some tipped over, others filled with broken tools or rainwater. This was where Lena had loved to sketch. It was also where Melody had once hidden her journals. And Helen's gut told her it held more secrets still. Shadow sniffed at a toppled watering can, while Halo paused near a forgotten bench and barked once, loud and clear, at a wall of ivy climbing an old trellis. Helen crouched and parted the foliage with her hands, revealing something buried beneath the tangle, a tin storage box, dusted with mulch and spider silk. She dragged it out slowly, the metal cool and slightly rusted under her fingers. "Good boy, Halo," she whispered, setting the box on a nearby bench. Inside were several neatly stacked envelopes, each sealed but unhidden. The top envelope was addressed in elegant handwriting Helen instantly recognized. To Camilla. In the event I cannot speak for myself. Helen's breath caught in her throat. She hesitated only a moment before opening it. The letter inside was written with the same strong hand as the address, the ink slightly smudged from what looked like water damage or tears. If you're reading this, it means someone didn't like the truth. I've documented everything I found. Fraud, forgeries, threats. It started with Melody's early pieces, but it didn't end there. Finn is copying again. Camilla, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to turn your studio into a crime scene, but the art world can be uglier than any murder mystery. Helen blinked, absorbing the weight of the words. Check the red sketchbook in my studio. It's all there. Helen stood slowly, clutching the envelope. There's one more puzzle piece, she whispered. Back inside Lena's private studio, Helen moved with reverence. It felt like walking into the remnants of someone's thoughts. The walls still smelled faintly of rosewater, paper, and old ink. Her fingers traced the spines of the sketchbooks neatly lined up on the shelf above Lena's drafting table. Spring, summer, fall, and there it was. A red sketchbook, slightly thicker than the others. She slid it out. The pages were exquisite, layered watercolors of the gardens, studies of studio members mid-creation, gentle notes in the margins about pigment mixes and lighting angles. It was like peeking into Lena's soul, piece by piece. Near the back, 2 pages were filled with handwritten notes. Helen leaned in. The Palette Club, unmasked. Each line had a set of initials, a real name, and notes in Lena's handwriting. MQ, Jasper Quinn, MW, Melody Weaver, CR, Camilla Rowan, FD, Finn Douglas, LC, Lena Carter, CW, Chad Warren. Helen stilled. Chad had been a member of the Palette Club, but she had scoured the flyer from the first meeting, and his initials weren't there. He'd erased himself, and Lena had found out. Below the list was one final line, circled in red. CW is blackmailing at least 2 members. Has recordings. Has access to studio camera feeds. Likely has motive to suppress truths. Dangerous. Helen closed the book with trembling hands. Lena hadn't just been confronting Chad about artistic theft. She had been about to expose a predator. Helen was still reeling when Mike arrived. He parked along the studio's main path and met her just outside the greenhouse. She could tell from his brisk pace and tight jaw that something had changed. "We got him," he said. Helen's heart skipped. "Chad?" Mike nodded. Ticket clerk at the bus depot recognized him from the studio brochure. He was trying to head north, maybe Canada. He's in custody now. Interviewed him this morning. Helen swallowed. Did he confess? Claims it was an accident, Mike said, but admits he didn't try to help her. Said he panicked, tossed the scarf, destroyed backup footage, except for the flash drive you found. That sealed it. Helen let out a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Lena was right. He was dangerous. Mike looked grim. He had access to everything. Emails, workshop sign-ups, internal schedules. He knew who was vulnerable. He extorted Melody, threatened to leak private documents about Finn's family. Lena figured it all out. And she died for it, Helen said, voice quiet. Mike nodded, but she didn't go down without a fight. That afternoon, Camilla gathered the studio's remaining members beneath the blooming magnolia tree in the courtyard. The petals trembled in the breeze, pale pink against the pale sky, as if mourning and celebrating all at once. A makeshift podium stood beside the fountain. A pitcher of lemonade sat untouched nearby. Helen stood at the back, her arms folded loosely, halo and shadow lying at her feet like sentinels. Camilla stepped up, sketchbook in hand. Snapdragon was meant to be a sanctuary, she began. A place where artists could be vulnerable, where they could grow without fear or competition. But we let secrecy fester. We let shadows bloom where there should have been light. She looked around the circle, at Melody, whose eyes were red, at Finn, pale and stoic, at Jasper, wringing his paint-stained hands. We trusted each other, and we were betrayed. Lena, she saw the truth, even when it hurt. She fought to protect the spirit of this place. She paid the highest price. Camilla held up the red sketchbook. No more anonymous submissions. No more backdoor deals. Credit will go where it's due. Transparency will be our policy from this point forward, and art will remain our purpose. There was a pause, then gentle applause, tears. A few people reached for each other's hands. Camilla stepped down and turned to Helen. "Thank you," she said, voice soft. "You helped us see what we missed." Helen smiled faintly. "Just a retired baker with nosy instincts." Camilla gave her a look. The best kind. That evening, the sun spilled soft lavender across Helen's porch as she sipped mint tea. Mike sat across from her, a well-earned bourbon in hand. The dog snoozed between them, finally relaxed. "You ever think about writing this stuff down?" Mike asked, swirling the ice in his glass. Helen chuckled. "Write it down? Who'd believe it? Cozy art retreats and accidental drownings don't exactly scream bedtime stories." "I'm serious. You've got a talent for seeing threads no one else does, for tying them up." Helen considered it. "Maybe I'll call it Secrets from Snapdragon," she mused. Mike smiled. "Catchy, very you." He paused. "You know," he said, "we never did get that dinner." Helen raised a brow. "You mean one that didn't end with a police report?" "Exactly that kind." She sipped her tea. "You're persistent." "I'm patient." "Good," she said. "I like patient." Just then, the mailbox creaked open. A small white envelope fluttered onto the stoop. Helen bent to pick it up, brow furrowing. The card inside was handwritten, with no return address. Helen Dash. Another mystery is blooming at Foxglove Fair. Hope you're not too tired of solving puzzles. An old friend. Helen smiled. Looks like her next adventure was already on the horizon. Chapter 9. Gilded Lies. The morning after Chad's arrest, Snapdragon Studio felt like it was breathing again, albeit slowly and through bruised ribs. The sky was a soft watercolor wash of pale pink and silvery gray, and the air carried the earthy scent of spring rain and renewal. As Helen walked up the gravel path, her boots crunching softly, she paused to glance at the budding dogwood tree near the gate. Its white blossoms seemed to tremble in the morning breeze, as if aware that something sacred had been restored, or at least no longer concealed. Inside, the usual early bird artists moved through the halls like softened brushstrokes, muted, purposeful, careful not to stir the tension that still lingered in the corners. Conversations were hushed. Glances were exchanged like secret notes. The news of Chad's confession had spread through the community like a wash on wet paper. Quickly, quietly, and leaving behind trails of suspicion, relief, and disbelief. That quiet man, the one who had silently fixed projectors, updated event calendars, and straightened chairs, had been pulling the strings of multiple lives like a marionette artist working in shadows. Lena had been the only one bold enough to threaten to cut those strings. And for that, she had paid the price. Helen arrived early, as she always did, but her arms were fuller than usual. Tucked within her woven basket were still warm orange cardamom buns, their citrusy fragrance curling into the air like a peace offering. Shadow and Halo padded beside her, tails swishing and noses twitching in anticipation. In the kitchen, she set the box on the side table and was greeted by a series of nods, hugs, and shy thank yous. Camilla gave her hand a grateful squeeze. Jasper, still emotionally raw from recent events, mumbled a quiet "thank you," and passed her a steaming cup of herbal tea. Even Finn, who had been tight-lipped and jittery for days, offered a weary but sincere pat on her shoulder. "Morning, Helen," he said, and there was a note in his voice, something close to gratitude or maybe release. But Helen hadn't come for praise or pastries. She still had one question burning in her mind. Who exactly was LC? Back in the archive room, the light filtering through the small window was golden and hazy, highlighting the dust motes that floated like suspended secrets in the air. Helen knelt beside a low shelf labeled Palette Club, Historical Records, and sifted through the partially catalogued contents. The portfolios smelled of old ink and cedarwood, and each page whispered fragments of the past. Finally, she found it. A slender sketchbook, soft worn along the spine, labeled only with the initials LC, dated from 4 years ago. Her fingers tingled as she opened it. The sketches inside were breathtaking, each page blooming with vivid florals, watercolor landscapes, and symbolic designs layered with meaning. There was a maturity in the technique, a wisdom of color and movement that Helen knew could only come from someone with years of unspoken experience. She paused at the last page. Written in delicate cursive was a message. For FD, use these as long as you like. Just don't stop creating. Her breath caught. FD, Finn Douglas. She squinted. The handwriting was familiar. The loops, the flourishes, the way the lowercase d curved into a trailing echo. She reached into her tote and pulled out one of Melody's recent apology notes. Side by side, they were unmistakable. Melody had been LC all along. Helen stood in the greenhouse, sketchbook clutched tightly to her chest. The air inside was humid and fragrant with damp soil, crushed thyme, and the faint perfume of orchids blooming above a moss-covered trellis. Sunlight filtered through the glass ceiling in long slants, pooling at her feet. Outside, the koi pond sparkled peacefully, its stillness a sharp contrast to the storm churning in Helen's mind. If Melody had submitted art under 2 identities, one of them a fictional dead sister, then her motivations weren't just emotional. They were layered, complex. She hadn't only wanted to support Finn, she wanted to be seen without being exposed, to be heard without being vulnerable. And Lena? Lena had sensed the deception. A rustling sound behind her pulled Helen from her thoughts. She turned. Melody stood in the arched doorway between the greenhouse and the studio, her ever-present weaving basket at her side, hands clasped like a schoolgirl expecting to be scolded. Her face looked pale, lips pressed into a line, but her eyes were clear and steady. "You figured it out," she said softly. Helen nodded. "You were LC." "I was," Melody replied, stepping into the light. "Lena Carter never existed, but I needed her. People didn't listen to Melody Weaver. I wasn't bold enough. I wasn't important enough. So I created someone who was." Helen said nothing. She waited. Melody looked down at her basket. "And I gave her to Finn. After his sister passed, he was lost, hollow. I left the sketchbook in his supply bin a few weeks later. He assumed it belonged to her. I never corrected him." "You were grieving with him," Helen said gently, "and maybe hoping to matter." Melody's voice cracked. "And part of me was jealous of the way people admired her, this fictional version of myself, even though she wasn't real." Helen stepped closer. "But Lena Voss saw through it." Melody nodded. "She recognized the work. She saw a signature I'd used years ago. She confronted me, said she was going to tell everyone, said the studio couldn't afford to be built on lies." "And you were afraid she was right." Melody clenched her hands tighter. "I never wanted her to die, but I wished she'd stay silent or go away. I just wanted things to stay the way they were." Helen placed a hand on Melody's arm. "You didn't kill her." "No," Melody whispered, "but I didn't stop her from walking into danger either." Later that day, Helen met Mike across the street at the tea shop. They sat by the window, mugs steaming between them, the clinking of ceramic and quiet jazz forming a peaceful backdrop. Shadow and Halo curled at their feet, tails thumping occasionally when crumbs fell. Helen pushed the sketchbook toward him. She created an entire identity, a whole artistic persona, all just to be taken seriously. Mike shook his head slowly, examining the pages. You'd be surprised how often people wear masks to be heard. It's not always sinister. No, Helen agreed. It was never about fame. It was about survival. But Lena saw the truth, and that threatened the illusion. And gave Chad the last puzzle piece, Mike added. Melody's secret gave him leverage over everyone. Helen leaned back. A lie that started with good intentions and spiraled into blackmail, betrayal, and murder. Mike looked thoughtful. So what happens now? Helen sipped her tea. Camilla will steady the ship. Melody, I think she'll step back for a while. As for Finn, well, the truth hurts, but it also frees. And you? Mike asked, smiling. Helen plucked a crumb off her napkin. Maybe it's time I told my own story. No aliases. Just a retired baker with a taste for trouble. Mike raised a brow. Going to start with Snapdragon? Helen nodded. It's the perfect beginning. Full of lies, love, and very nosy Labradors. They laughed softly. Across the street, the Snapdragon Studio windows shimmered in the light. Inside, artists returned to their easels and clay wheels, finding comfort in color and creation once more. And somewhere in the shadows of old secrets, Helen knew, another story was already blooming. Chapter 10. Caught in the Act. The skies over Snapdragon Studio had turned bright again, blue and sharp-edged, the kind of spring day that makes you forget it ever rained. The kind of day where the light feels almost too clear, revealing cracks in painted facades and truths long buried under moss and politeness. But inside, tensions were anything but sunny. Helen stood in Camilla's office with Sheriff Mike, sunlight streaming through the stained glass window, dappling the carpet in shards of crimson and violet. The red sketchbook lay open between them on the desk, its pages fluttering slightly under the breath of the ceiling fan. The silence was thoughtful, edged with unease. Melody's truth had changed everything. The fictional Lena Carter, LC, was more than just a pen name. She had been a lifeline, a disguise, and a quiet rebellion against the invisible walls Melody had long felt trapped behind. She'd created LC not just for herself, but for Finn, to help him grieve, to give him something to believe in when he was too broken to hold on. But the question remained, who exactly tried to erase Lena Voss? Chad had confessed to letting her drown, yes, but he still denied pushing her. His version of the story had too many shadows, too few edges. It smelled like half-truths. And Helen wasn't ready to believe he was the only one involved. Not with all the secrets that had surfaced. You think there's still something missing? Mike asked, arms crossed. Helen tapped the open page of the sketchbook. Yes, Melody's secret explains why Lena was angry. Finn's grief explains why he never saw it. But there's more. Lena wrote a line in this notebook. Check the red sketchbook. It's all there. But it's not. There are gaps. Missing context. There's a reference to a meeting that's never recorded. A final confrontation she mentions, but never details. Mike frowned. Maybe she didn't get around to writing it down. Helen shook her head, her voice sure. No, Lena was meticulous. You know how some artists are, documenting everything like breadcrumbs. If she had something big, something dangerous, she wouldn't have forgotten it. She would have hidden it. She turned a page and pointed to a tiny folded edge in the corner. A tab, she said, like it once held something. Mike leaned in, squinting. A note? Or a letter, maybe something she meant to confront someone with, something too risky to leave lying around. He stepped back, thoughtful. So where's the missing piece? That afternoon, Helen retraced Lena's final steps. She walked the winding garden paths, her boots crunching against gravel and moss, the scent of lavender and lemon balm rising with every step. The sun cast long shadows through the trellises, and the koi pond shimmered under its watchful light, its serenity belying the fact that it had almost become a grave. Shadow and Halo darted ahead, sniffing and circling with their usual diligence. They knew the routine now. Investigation walks were part of their job. Loyal detectives with wet noses and boundless energy. Helen paused at the greenhouse, stepping briefly inside to check the shelves and cracked pots. Nothing new, just ivy reclaiming what had been left behind. From there, she followed the gravel path toward the pottery shed. It sat slightly off to the side of the main buildings, tucked behind a veil of tall reeds and clay-stained stepping stones. A temporarily closed sign hung askew from the doorknob, flapping gently in the breeze. Inside, the scent of clay, ash, and forgotten projects clung to the air. The tools were still, the kilns dark. Helen moved carefully, checking drawers, lifting lids, opening cabinets. Shadow trotted to a narrow cupboard near the back and sat, ears perked, tail still. Helen opened it, empty. Then Halo let out a sharp bark. She turned and saw him circling behind a shelf, nose pressed against the slats. Helen crouched, pushed aside a box of broken ceramic tiles. And there it was. A folded slip of paper, just barely visible, wedged between two drying racks. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled it free. It was a letter, a short one. To M.W. If you won't admit the truth, I'll have no choice but to do it for you. You can't hide behind initials anymore. I gave you every chance. This is the last warning. Tomorrow, I go public. L.V. Helen stared at it, heart thudding. This wasn't addressed to Finn. This was for Melody. Camilla's reaction was swift. She must have slipped it in there after their argument, she said, pacing the office. Or maybe Melody dropped it, or hid it, or... Camilla, Helen interrupted gently. This changes things. The director halted mid-step. Melody already admitted to the LC identity. What more could this prove? That Lena had zero intention of keeping her silence, Helen said. Melody may have been scared, but so might someone else. Camilla's face paled slightly. What do you mean? Helen held her gaze. Someone who thought the LC revelation would drag the entire studio down. Camilla was quiet for a long moment. Then, my name is in the Palette Club records. Helen nodded. If the scandal became public, you could lose donors. The grants might dry up. Even a hint of mismanagement. My reputation, Camilla whispered. Helen didn't press. She simply watched. You think I killed her? Camilla asked finally. Helen's voice was soft. I think you've worked very hard to protect this place. I think you've carried guilt for things that weren't your fault. And I think you've been trying to hold together a sanctuary that was already cracking. Camilla let out a long, uneven breath. I was angry at her. I told her she didn't understand what this place meant, that she didn't care about people's growth, just about exposing their flaws. Helen asked gently, But did you confront her that night? Camilla's shoulders sagged. No, I went home. I stewed. I poured a glass of wine and stayed up too late, but I didn't go back. Helen believed her. Camilla had buried secrets, but not bodies. That evening, Helen sat at her kitchen table, teacup in hand, the sketchbook and timeline spread before her. She went over every note, every detail, and then she noticed it. A still image from Chad's surveillance footage, paused at the moment Lena stumbled. Chad was clearly in the frame, arm extended, mouth open in mid-yell. But behind him, barely noticeable, a shadow. Not a reflection, a third figure. Helen zoomed in. A shoulder, part of a sleeve. Someone standing behind the trellis, just outside the fight, but close enough to hear and close enough to intervene. They hadn't. Helen stared at the image for a full minute before whispering, Someone else was there. She returned to the greenhouse that night with Mike, a flashlight in hand. Together, they retraced the scene. The camera's angle, Lena's last steps, the precise position where Chad had stood. There's no way that silhouette was a trick of the light, Helen said. Someone else stood here, watching, maybe waiting. Mike nodded slowly. That would explain why Chad's story feels hollow. There was someone else in the garden. Helen swept her light across the flower bed. And they didn't help. That makes them more than a witness. Halo trotted over to the bench and whined. Helen followed, and saw it. Carved faintly into the wood, worn down by weather and time but still legible, were the initials, JQ plus LV. Her heart lurched. Jasper Quinn. She found Jasper the next morning in the studio parking lot, loading boxes into the trunk of his car. His movements were sharp, agitated. Sunglasses masked his eyes, but the tension in his jaw, the stiffness in his shoulders, those told the story. "Running?" Helen asked. He froze. "I'm not involved," he said quickly. "If you're here to accuse me—" "She trusted you," Helen interrupted. "Lena, more than she let on. Did you love her?" He looked away. "We were close. Not romantic, but close. She understood me, knew I'd made mistakes. She didn't judge me. She pushed me to do better." Helen stepped closer. "She mentioned you in her notes. She knew someone was using her reputation to control others. Someone who knew the Palette Club inside and out." Jasper was silent. "She told you she was going to expose it," Helen said. "And you were scared. Not of being caught, of losing her." Still silence. "You were there that night," she said softly. "You saw the fight. You saw her fall, and you ran." His voice, when it came, was barely audible. "I thought she'd get up. She always got back up. I didn't think— You could have helped her. I panicked. I was afraid it would unravel everything." Helen stepped back. "She died trying to clean up a mess she didn't create," she said. "And you let her fall alone." Jasper sank onto the bumper of his car, head in his hands. Helen didn't speak again. She didn't have to. Chapter 11. Framed. The studio felt heavy that morning, as though the weight of all its secrets had finally settled into the walls. Sunlight still spilled through the arched windows and warmed the wooden floors, but the brightness did little to cut through the lingering shadows. Snapdragon Studio was breathing again, yes, but with a kind of hollow fatigue, as if it had been holding its breath for too long and now wasn't sure how to exhale. Helen stood near the koi pond, where Lena Voss had taken her final breath. The water lilies floated in pale, peaceful clusters, the petals soft and pink, and utterly indifferent to the violence that had once rippled their waters. A single koi swam beneath the surface, trailing gold and white beneath the floating blooms, as if unaware that this place had become sacred and stained all at once. She had walked this path many times since Lena's death, but today felt different. Today the mystery had a shape, even if it hadn't yet fully solidified. She stared down at the water and tried to imagine the scene again. Lena and Chad, the argument, the fateful slip. And then Jasper, standing silent in the shadows, frozen with fear. It was almost too poetic, too tragic, too human to be fiction. Helen closed her eyes for a moment and breathed in the scents of spring, lavender, damp stone, sun-warmed wood. The dogs stood at her side, Shadow calm and alert, Halo watching a bird dance along the fence line. They were almost at the end. Almost. Mike met her in Lena's private studio. The once vibrant space was quiet now, the air perfumed with stale ink and fading rosewater. A thin layer of dust had begun to settle on the windowsills, as if the room itself had gone into mourning. Shadow and Halo lay at the door, their presence grounding, their patience unshaken. Helen placed the red sketchbook, the letters, and a small ceramic tile on the work table, like puzzle pieces finally ready to be assembled. "This is the last of it," she said. Mike nodded. "Jasper's cooperating. He's agreed to testify. Chad's in holding, quiet, but not denying what we know." Helen looked toward the sunlight pouring in through the glass. "And Melody?" "She's gone home to stay with family. Camilla gave her a paid leave. Might be permanent." Helen sighed. The news didn't surprise her. Melody had carried her guilt like a silk scarf, elegant, quiet, but suffocating. "That's probably for the best," she said softly. She picked up the ceramic tile, tracing the design with her thumb. It bore a delicate glazed pattern Lena had once displayed at her spring exhibit. Roses blooming into flame, an arresting image of beauty and destruction. But the signature in the corner wasn't Lena's. It was Melody's, buried beneath a coat of reddish glaze. Helen turned the tile in her hand. Everything's connected, she murmured. Art, ego, grief, all of it hidden in plain sight. Mike crossed his arms. Lena wasn't a saint, but she didn't deserve to be erased. She wasn't trying to destroy anyone, Helen added. She was just trying to protect what was real. She wanted this place to stand for something, and maybe she pushed too hard, but she was right. Mike gestured to the table. And you unraveled the whole web. Helen smiled faintly. I just paid attention. Camilla held a staff meeting that afternoon in the greenhouse. The entire studio gathered. Artists, volunteers, instructors, a few students who had once adored Lena and were now learning to remember her in complex shades. The atmosphere was more hushed than solemn, like a chapel just before the hymn begins. Sunlight poured in from the arched panes overhead, catching on the dew-speckled leaves. Camilla stood in front of the trellis where Lena used to sketch, her blouse fluttering slightly in the warm breeze. I want to thank you all, she began, her voice clear but filled with emotion. Snapdragon Studio has always stood for growth, expression, and community. But we forgot something important along the way. That truth matters more than polish. That being an artist means showing your real face, even when it's imperfect. She paused, eyes scanning the gathered group. We lost someone who challenged us, someone who asked hard questions, who forced us to confront the cracks in our foundation, and because of her, because of what she uncovered, we now have a chance to rebuild, stronger, wiser, more honest. She stepped aside and gestured toward the bulletin board, where a new set of principles had been pinned. New Code of Honor. All artists must sign their real names. No more anonymous critiques. All collaborative works must be transparent. Forgiveness is offered, but trust must be earned. There was a long pause, a few murmurs, the shuffle of shoes on gravel. Then Finn stepped forward, his face solemn, and placed a small clay rose on the central table. For Lena, he said. Others followed, a watercolor of hummingbirds, a bundle of pressed herbs, a pair of silver earrings shaped like leaves, a weaver's ribbon in midnight blue. One by one, they contributed to a quiet, humble memorial. Not flashy, not curated, but real. That evening, Helen returned to her cottage and fed the dogs. Shadow devoured his dinner with enthusiasm. Halo, as usual, was more meditative, chewing slowly and watching the back garden through the screen door. Helen reached into her recipe drawer and pulled out an old, worn index card, Lena's cinnamon apple galette. The recipe had been written in Lena's bold, looping print. She'd shared it during a spring workshop, promising it was the best comfort food for creative fatigue. Helen had planned to bake it for Lena the weekend after the show. Now she would bake it in Lena's memory. As she chopped apples and rolled out the dough, her thoughts flickered like pages in a wind-blown book. Melody's secret, Finn's unwitting theft, Jasper's guilt, Chad's cowardice, Camilla's burden, and Lena. Always Lena, brilliant and flawed and so deeply human. The galette slid into the oven, filling the kitchen with a warm, spiced fragrance that softened the edges of the day. Helen sat down at her desk. Then she picked up her pen. An hour later, Mike knocked at the door. He looked rumpled but content, like a man who had finished a long chapter and wasn't sure how to begin the next one. She handed him a warm slice on a napkin. "Justice has a crust today?" he asked. Helen smiled, and a cinnamon glaze. He leaned against the porch railing, looking out over the dusk-lit yard where bees still drifted lazily between the last blooms of spring. "So," he said, "what happens next?" Helen took a sip of tea. "I got a postcard the other day, from a friend who runs a booth at Foxglove Fair." Mike arched a brow. "Another mystery?" Helen grinned. "Something about a missing heirloom, a haunted tea shop, and a suspicious flower arrangement." Shadow barked once. Halo tilted his head, tail thumping the porch floor. Mike chuckled. "Of course. And I assume you're packing your sketchbook?" "And my pie server," she said. "Would it be too forward?" he added. "If I asked to tag along this time? For the mystery, I mean." Helen bumped his shoulder gently. Only if you promise not to arrest the tea ladies before I have a chance to question them." "Deal," he said with a smile. And just like that, the next chapter began. Epilogue, a whisper from Foxglove. 3 weeks later, Helen stood in her sun-drenched kitchen, folding linen napkins into a small woven basket. The scent of lemon balm and rosemary wafted through the open window, carried in on a breeze that promised summer wasn't far off. Shadow lounged beneath the table like a shaggy footstool, while Halo sat by the screen door, tail wagging as if he knew something was coming. The postcard on the counter confirmed it. It had arrived that morning in a pale pink envelope stamped with a spray of pressed foxglove blossoms. The front read, "Foxglove Fair, Annual Artisan Market and Botanical Showcase. Whispering Vale, South Carolina, where every flower has a secret." Helen turned it over again. In familiar, loopy handwriting, a message was scribbled along the side. Helen. "There's something strange happening at the tea house again. The blooms are wilting, the heirloom necklace is gone, and Aunt Lil says the old mirror's talking again. Bring the dogs, and extra lemon bars. May." Helen smiled, heart already quickening. May was an old friend from her baking days, part herbalist, part gossip collector, and entirely unafraid of scandal. Whispering Vale had always been a curious little town, and Foxglove Fair had a reputation for beauty, drama, and more than one incident involving teacups and truth potions. She slipped the postcard into her travel folder and called out, "Boys, ready for a road trip?" Shadow perked up immediately, while Halo gave a single sharp bark and trotted toward the hallway where his leash hung. Helen packed lightly, 2 sundresses, 1 wide-brimmed hat, and a folder labeled Active Investigations. She added a fresh tray of lemon bars, a copy of her recipe for galette, and a tiny notebook embossed with the initials HL, gifted to her by Camilla before she left Snapdragon. Mike arrived just as she zipped the travel bag. He wore jeans and a rolled-up Oxford shirt, looking like a man equally ready for a crime scene or a farmer's market. In one hand was a small thermos, in the other, a bouquet of sweet peas and 1 sprig of foxglove. "For the detective/baker/dog mom," he said. Helen grinned. "You remembered the sprig," he winked. "Well, I hear it's symbolic." "What's it mean again?" He tilted his head. "Foxglove? Insincerity? Or maybe intuition, depending who you ask." Helen took the flowers, set them in a mason jar by the window, and opened the door. "Well then," she said, "let's go find out which one it is." And with the dogs in the back seat, Mike at her side, and a mystery waiting in a garden full of secrets, Helen drove toward the next chapter,